Well, welcome to part 3 of our Summer on the Mount series. We are so excited about what God's been doing already today. We've been worshiping, we've been seeing people say yes to God, seeing people baptized. It has been a great day today. We're so thrilled. And before I jump into our message, I wanted to share with you something that I'm so excited about. I'm pumped about this. It's another thing we're highlighting on our Summer on the Mount series, and it is a summer Bible reading plan. In fact, if you have not yet downloaded the app, whatever phone you have, search the Highlands Christian Fellowship on the App Store and download our free app, because there's something that I want to share with you before we get our message today that I am pumped about. It's our Bible reading plan, and you can click on the app, and as you see on the screen, click on Bible, you'll see that word plan right there. That's our Summer on the Mount Bible reading plan. And what it is, it's a harmony of the Gospels plan. If you've never read the Gospels this way, basically what it is you're reading the life of Jesus across all 4 Gospels at the same time. So this past week, we read about the baptism of Jesus across the Gospels, and you're seeing different details, kind of as you're reading the story. It's so awesome. And then the next screen, because a cool feature, and my personal favorite way of reading the Bible is actually to listen to the Bible. And so you can listen to the Bible as you're getting ready, as you're driving, as you're doing something, to just kind of allow the Bible to kind of come through a different way. And aside from reading the Bible, my favorite part of this whole plan is at the end when you complete it, because then it gives you this blue check mark. Are there any other check mark addicts like me where you have your to-do list app and you actually put things in your app so you can get yourself the reward of a check mark? No, that's just me? Okay, well, I have issues, and I'll deal with those later. And so, but one of my favorite things, this is going to be a great plan to read. And then at the end of the summer, you'll have read through the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and getting more of an understanding about the life of Jesus. And so Jesus, in Matthew 5, begins to teach his most famous sermon on his time on earth. It was the Sermon on the Mount. Now, last week, we looked at the first Beatitude, where Pastor Amy shared that blessed are the poor in spirit. And then we jumped right into part 2 on Wednesday night with Pastor Billy, talking about blessed are those who mourn. And so now we're looking at the third beatitude that Jesus shares in Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. And by the way, scholars believe that as Jesus is sharing these beatitudes, they actually get harder as you begin reading them. And so you'll find that this third one is a little bit more challenging as we kind of get into what Jesus' teaching is. But here's what it says in verse 5 of Matthew 5. It says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Now we're going to reverse engineer this verse and look at the beginning or the end part of this verse and work our way back, because there's a great word in this verse that we need to talk about first, and that's the word inherit. Inherit. See, an inheritance is something that you gain because of who you know. Now, if you're watching this online, or let us know in the chat if you've ever received an inheritance. And if you are here in person, if you've ever received an inheritance, would you raise your hand? You've received an inheritance from parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. Keep those hands raised, because I want to know who you are and become your friend after the service, okay? I need to see where you are. I've actually never received an inheritance. I don't have a crazy or a fun inheritance story to share, but I did read a crazy story lately where a billionaire New York businesswoman named Leona, her husband passed away, and she bought a dog, a Maltese named Trouble. And after many years with this dog, she passed away and left a $12 million inheritance to this Maltese named Trouble. Now, that judge later amended that inheritance down to a paltry $2 million inheritance, but that dog, for the next few years, was able to live a life like no other Maltese in the history of Maltese dogs. And so then when that Maltese passed away, she, in her will, stipulated that that dog was to be buried alongside her in the family mausoleum. And so inheritance is something that you gain not because of who you are or what you've done. An inheritance is something you gain because of who you know. But here's one thing about an inheritance, is that inheritances often take years or decades to receive. Now, it's the same with the Christian life. In fact, as we get through the next 109 verses on the Sermon on the Mount this summer, you're going to find that the Christian life, this rooted disciple life that God's called us to, is not an instant gratification life. There's a lot of things that God is calling us to wait on and to receive in his timing. And so Jesus, he declares, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." It's not because of what you've done, it's because of who you know, but it's also not given to you on your timing, it's given to you on the Lord's timing. And so now we find that an inheritance is something that is coming to us because of who we know, but who is it coming to? Well, it's coming to the meek. Now that word meek gets a bad rap sometimes. It's kind of maybe misconstrued in its definitions, but that word meek simply means this. It means to be gentle, humble, considerate, and courteous. Now think about those words: gentle, humble, considerate, courteous. I mentioned a moment ago that as you get into the Beatitudes, they become progressively harder to live out. And this one is of no difference. Now, the first two Beatitudes we talked about, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, those are lived out on our own. Now, they're important, but those are between you and God. Do you know what happens in this third Beatitude? Other people get involved. Now, have you ever realized that it would be easier to live the Christian life if it weren't for other people? Am I alone in this, where I think I could be a pretty great Christian if it wasn't for other people around me? If I lived in a vacuum or a bubble, I think I might be the greatest Christian to ever live, because I wouldn't have to deal with other people. But that's not our reality. In fact, this past week I was on an airplane going to a conference, and the guy who sat next to me, he, on his laptop, full blast with no headphones, was watching the movie Dumb and Dumber. And I had noise-canceling earbuds in my ears, and I could still hear his movie, and I was so annoyed and so frustrated. My first thought was, what an appropriate movie for this guy to be watching right now, Dumb and Dumber. Come on, I can't even believe this. It was not my first tendency to be meek to this guy on the plane. And how hard is it to live the Christian life when other people are involved? Man, if I just had my own thing, if nobody else was there, I would be a pretty great Christian, but that's just not our reality. And so as we move into this sermon, we need to realize that God's calling us to live the life He's called us to in the context of other people. And so unfortunately, or fortunately, however you view people are involved in your life, and we have to be gentle, humble, considerate, courteous, meek towards them. But honestly, when we think about meekness, not only is it lived out with other people, but the other strike against meekness is it's not a quality that most people want in our current society. Now think about this. How many gentle, humble, considerate, courteous politicians do you know? How many gentle, humble, considerate, courteous celebrities and athletes have you met, have you seen? In fact, even maybe bring it closer to home, how many gentle, humble, considerate, courteous bosses have you worked for? And this is a moment where we're like, man, meekness is not high on the job description. It's not found really in an interview process of how meek you are, because it is not valued in our society. But in God's economy, in how He's shaping you, meekness is huge. Gentle, humble, considerate, courteous. You see, meekness, it denotes this humility, this humble, this gentle attitude that we have because we know who we are in Jesus and we know whose we are, that we have Him wrapped around us. Now, there's two other instances of this word meek found in the New Testament. One is describing, Jesus uses it to describe Himself. It's in Matthew chapter 11. In verse number 28, He says this. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary, all you who are burdened, and I will give you rest." And then He says in verse 29, "Take up my yoke and learn from me." Look at this phrase. "Because I am lowly and humble in heart." That's that word meek. "And you will find rest for your souls." Now, Jesus is describing Himself as lowly and humble in heart. Now, again, that's not something that describes too many people in society today. But again, Jesus is calling us to a countercultural life. A life that doesn't make sense or doesn't always kind of jibe with what we see in our society. And Jesus is calling us into this life where we realize meekness is not weakness. Meekness is true strength because we know who we are in Jesus. You see, meek disciples are confident but not cocky. They are steadfast, but they are not stressed. They are principled, but they are not political. But ultimately, meek disciples are resembling Jesus. Because Jesus describes Himself as meek, as lowly, and humble of heart. But there's another place that we find this word meek in 1 Peter, and Peter writes this in his book in chapter 3. Here's what he says in verse 3. He says, "Don't let your beauty consist of outward things like elaborate hairstyles and wearing gold jewelry or fine clothes, but rather what is inside the heart." And here's the word again. "The imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit." That's that word meek. But then look what he writes next. He says, "which is of great worth in God's sight." Now, this may not be of great worth in our society, in our culture, or even at your workplace, but in God's sight, This meek and lowly spirit, this imperishable quality of a gentle, quiet spirit is of great worth. Now, meek disciples don't allow other people to walk over them, or they're not pushovers. But what that happens is they honor and they respect all those around them. And when you do that, by the way, Peter says that is of great worth in God's sight. And so as we think about this idea of being meek, let me encourage you, because you might say, man, you don't understand the work site I go to, the construction zone that I'm in. You don't understand meekness is probably looked down upon. And let me tell you that living the life of Jesus has called us to is countercultural. It's different. But if we'll allow God's word to get inside, if we'll resemble and follow Jesus, that inheritance that he speaks about is coming our way. And so we find here that Jesus, as he's telling us, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Scholars believe that he's finishing up some teaching that David wrote back in the Psalms. So if you have your Bible or perhaps your app, turn over to Psalm chapter 37, because we're going to find some marks of a meek disciple here in Psalm chapter 37. And David begins the thought that Jesus finishes on the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, I've got to warn you, okay, we have 5 marks of a meek disciple, but today I'm only going to give you 3 of them. We're going to save the other 2 for some bonus content later this week, which means this. If you're that type A personality, or you have to have all your blanks filled before you leave, today is not going to be your day. It's going to be really upsetting. So sorry, but not sorry. Just come back later this week. In fact, we disabled the blanks so you can't guess the word of the 4 and 5 marks, okay? So you're going to have to wait till later this week to find the last 2, but I'm going to share with you the first 3 as we think about what a meek disciple looks like. Here's what David writes in Psalm 37, verse 1. He writes this. He says, do not be agitated by evildoers, and do not envy those who do wrong. Now, that is a hard thing. I'm like, David, that is easier said than done. Do not be agitated by evildoers. Like, David, did you have anybody around you that was an evildoer? Because it seems like you had lived a pretty good life. But David had a guy who threw a spear at his head, who chased him all over the country, trying to hunt him down. David knew what it was like to have evildoers in his life, and he says, do not be agitated. And in verse 2, he says this, for those evildoers, they wither quickly like grass, and they wilt like tender green plants. The first mark of a meek disciple I want to share with you is this. It's the word focus. Meek disciples, they stay in their lane. Now we think here, David says, hey, don't get heated, don't get burned up, but instead, cool down. Don't get agitated. Stay in your lane. But we know how we are, right? We think the other line is faster. We think the other line is wider. We think the other grass is greener. But what we find out is that line is not faster because up there, someone's pulling out a checkbook to pay for their groceries with their check, and you know it's going to take a long time. Like, oh, I switched lines. Or you're driving and you're commuting tomorrow and you think that lane's wider, and all of a sudden it merges and now you're stuck behind this big rig. Or we think that grass is greener, so we're going to look and we forget that it's not grass over there, it's actually weeds that make it look lush, and it's not better on that side. And so David, he writes here in verse 2, he says, for they wither quickly like the grass. And I'll be honest with you, that verse, it hits home for me because a few years ago, my wife Amy and I, we bought this foreclosed home, which had a lot of work to do. And we began to list out a project list and have all these things. And one of the things on this list that we wanted to work on was the front yard because it was completely it was dirt. And so my wife greatly offended me when she suggested that we should plant sod in the front. And I said, do you even know who I am? I don't believe in sod. You see, when I was younger, we grew up in Lake LA, and my dad and we had this project where we put grass seed in the front. We put sprinklers, we tilled the land, we planted the grass, and we had the only green grass in Lake LA. And so grass seed was important. It was part of my upbringing. And so I said, Amy, we do not have sod in the Mel household. We will plant grass. And so I began to work on the front yard, and I began to till the ground and make sure sprinklers were working. And I began to plant the seed, and I watered, and then I began to wait and wait and wait. And 3 years later, I'm still waiting. You see, my front lawn is grass and weeds with more weeds than grass. That's not weed, that's weeds, okay? I just want to be clear on that. But what I'm finding out in my own front yard is this: I'm close to breaking to saying, let's just rip out it didn't work and let's just put sod in, and I'm going to, throw up all my convictions apparently. But what I've found is the reason there's not a lot of grass growing is because there's not a lot of deep roots. And what David is writing here to these people that are listening, he says, hey, those people who are evildoers, who you think is so far ahead of you, who you think that their line is faster, who you think their lane is wider, who you think their grass is greener, do you know what's happening? Their grass is withering. They're not having this deep-rooted life. It's shallow. It's superficial. And so meek disciples stay focused. Because many times you and I, we think, man, like my evil neighbor has a better lawn than I do. Well, that's okay. My manipulative boss has a nicer car than I do, and that's fine. My shady uncle has more toys than I do. Like, what's going on? And many times we say, you know what, that's okay. We're not going to be worried. We're not going to be agitated by those because we are focused. We are staying true to what God has called us to. We're going to stay in our lane. We're going to be focused on what God's called us to. We're not going to turn to the right or to the left. We're going to move forward with what God has called us to do because we are meek disciples. That line is not faster. That lane is not wider. That grass is not greener. Meek disciples stay in their lane because they are focused. The second characteristic, the second mark I want to share with you is found in the next verse, in verse 3, where David goes on to say, hey, trust in the Lord and do what is right. And then he says this, dwell in the land and live securely. The second mark I want to share with you is this mark of trust. Trust. You see, not only do meek disciples stay in their lane, meek disciples stay in one place. Now, if meekness is a foreign idea in our culture, then trust definitely follows right behind, because trust is often this fleeting quality in society these days. In fact, you go to the workplace and it's like this precious commodity that rarely makes an appearance in our life. But Jesus says the meek will inherit the earth. And the meek disciple trust. The meek disciple trusts that God is moving in their life. So instead of trusting God to move sometimes, we move ourselves. The reason sometimes we shift from job to job, from relationship to relationship, from location to location is because we're not trusting that God is moving fast enough for us, and so we have to move ourselves. Well, if I can only get to this zip code, if I can only have this relationship, if I can only have this job title, if I can only have this amount in my 401k, then I'll be set. And we're putting our trust in other things. But God tells us, hey, stay in one place. That's why David writes, dwell in the land and live securely. Because we're not thinking that those things are better. We're sticking with what God has called us to. Because many times you and I, we take those things. We move or we leave because we're not trusting in God. That's why we often will jump from job to job. We'll leave relationship to relationship. We'll move from church to church because we need to see God moving. And it's not moving fast enough, so we're gonna move around. But meek disciples, they trust, and they stay in one place. Have you seen that many times people enter a relationship, but they have an eye out for someone better? They get that job title or they get that promotion, and immediately they're looking at, okay, what's the next rung? What's the next step for me? They get that new house that they wanted, but their neighbor has a better backyard than they do. Their pool is deeper, that's wider, and all of a sudden now they're like, oh, I got to move again, because we're not staying in one place. Too often you and I will move around because we're not trusting in God enough that He's going to bring us through. Now, I'm not saying that if you get a job promotion or if you move that you're out of God's will. Please don't misunderstand me, but what I'm saying is often the underlying motive in those moves is because we need to make something happen rather than let God work in our life. David says, hey, trust in the Lord, dwell in that land securely. Too often I've seen people who, they move and they leave, and there is just right on the precipice of God's blessing that they missed out because they made things on their own. And how many times have you and I missed out on blessings in our life because we just got too impatient? We just got too restless. We just got too this idea that we have to make things happen. I've been here for a while, so I just need to keep things going. And God says, no, trust me. Live in that land securely. Because I have blessings. I have an inheritance for you that I don't want you to miss out on, but you must trust me. And many times you and I, we just are moving. Have you ever noticed this, by the way? We always like moving. Like, even on vacation, like we have every moment planned. You set your alarm on vacation, which, by the way, if you set your alarm on vacation, what are you doing? Like, if you hear nothing else from this message, do not set an alarm on your vacation. That's the time where you get rid of the alarms. But we have everything planned, and that's why we need a vacation from the vacation, because we're always moving, always doing these things, always going to the next thing, and we are never content. We never stay in one place. You see, a meek disciple, they focus. God, you've called me in this lane. I will not turn. I'm going to focus on you. But a meek disciple, they also trust. God, I don't know what you're doing. It seems a little bit, your timeline and my timeline are far different. God, it doesn't seem like things are working my way, but they stay in one place. There's a third mark of a meek disciple that we find, and that's this word delight. Delight. You see, a meek disciple has delight, which here's what it means. It means they stay in God's presence. I love what David writes in verse number 4. He says this. He says, take delight in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desires. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. He will make your righteousness shine like the dawn, and your justice like the noonday. Now, David is encouraging people to delight in the Lord. I love that word delight. It's this idea of like pampering yourself, of luxury. And what it means is that when we are with God, that is all that matters. When we are in God's presence, nothing else even comes close in comparison. Now, if we're honest with ourselves, we like God's presence. We'll come into a service, we'll join online, we'll worship, we'll see this, and this is good, this is enjoyable. We like this. And then we leave God's presence until the next service. But David's writing here, he says, hey, take delight in the Lord. And what it means is that God's presence is your number one priority. That you are only focused, you are zeroed in on delighting and staying in the presence of God. And you realize that God's presence is not confined to this building or to an address. It is with you wherever you go. And so you're feeling God's presence here, not because of you're in this building that has the sound panels or it has the lighting or has this effect or has that. You're here because God is with you. And God's presence is here because of you. Meek disciples delight. They stay in God's presence. But if we're honest, we want to pair God's presence with something else. Well, God, if I just have your presence and CarPlay in my car, that's a good life. Well, God, if I just have your presence and a bigger 401k nest egg, then that's really the best life. Well, God, if I have you plus this promotion, then, oh, God, that's going to be good. Well, God, if I have you plus my kid getting into their number one choice, God, then that's it. But David's saying, you don't need that. All you need is God's presence. And then he writes the next part. He says, not only should you take delight in God, but then he says, he will give you your heart's desire. And sometimes there's a misunderstanding where we think, okay, God, I'm going to come worship with you. I'm going to be in your presence. And, here's my list of things I need you to do for me. And we give our desires to him and say, okay, God, these are in order of importance. So if you can give me this one and then this one, and I'll come back and I'll give you a month for these first three because they're a little bit harder. And then I'll come back and I want you to fulfill my desires. And David says, no, hey, when you're delighting in God's presence, do you know what changes? Your desires. Because all those things you thought were important are temporary and do not last. And so let me encourage you, church, to delight. Because then your desires change. Your heart becomes more like God's. And all those things you thought mattered don't. You see, meek disciples, they stay in God's presence. That is all that matters. And you know what happens to those who are meek? An inheritance is coming. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if that's a monetary thing on earth or if that's something spiritual we have in heaven. I don't know what that inheritance looks like. It may even look different for others. But what I do know is that is what I want because that is where God is. And so we are meek because God has called us to. That's the life Jesus is living. He described himself as, and I don't know about you, but I want to be in the company of Jesus. I want to be in God's presence. And if someone were to make fun of me and say, man, I can't believe you follow that Jesus guy, I'm like, that is a badge of honor. Like, there are far worse things that you could call me that man, like, I would be called a Jesus follower, a disciple of Jesus, because I am meek, which means I am gentle, I am humble, I am courteous, I'm considerate. And yes, it is hard to live this life with other people, but we move forward because God has called us to. And so we say, hey, I'm focused. I'm staying in my lane, God. It seems like things are going faster around me. Seems like grass is greener, but you've called me to this place, so I'm staying in my lane. But then I'm going to stay in one place because I'm trusting that you're moving. I may not see it. It may seem like people are going 100 miles an hour and I'm still stuck in 45, but you know what? I'm trusting you, God. You are the one that I'm following. I'm going to live in this land securely. And then we say, God, I'm going to delight in your presence, because that is where I want to be. I don't like your presence. I delight in your presence, and that is where I want to be. And so meek disciples, you know what they say? God, you are all we need. Now, if you've noticed, and to give you a hint for these next two, the key word for a meek disciple is stay. Now, as I mentioned, it's going to get harder as we read through these Beatitudes. Pastor Jim's continuing our series on Wednesday, so buckle up. But when we think about these Beatitudes, when we think about the meek disciple, God's calling us to stay. And in a society of hurry and moving and always going, that's hard to do. But that blessing is coming, that inheritance is yours as you stay. Stay in one place, stay in your lane, stay in God's presence, and you will find yourself not only as a meek disciple, but as a follower who is resembling Jesus. And that is what we do. And that is who we are. We become rooted disciples of Jesus as we become meek to a world that desperately, desperately needs it. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me as we wrap up our time together? I want to give you an opportunity to consider for just a moment what area of those three words, whether it was focus, whether it was trust, or whether it was delight, what area can you even right now say, God, this is an area that I need your strength in now. I'm not staying in my lane. I'm getting agitated by those around me who seems like they have life put together, and I'm trying to follow you, and it's not working out. Maybe you're not staying in one place. You're just moving from thing to thing because you think that zip code or that title or that new role or that new relationship will change everything for you. But you've forgotten the third mark, which is you must stay in God's presence and delight in him. What area has a meek disciple do you need to say, Jesus, I'm going to stay. I'm going to stay in your presence. I'm going to stay in one place. I'm going to stay in my lane because I trust you. I don't want this world's inheritance. I want yours. And so I'm going to follow you. While you're considering that and asking God's Spirit to work in you and reveal something that you can work on and live out this week, I want to talk to those who perhaps have never said yes to God. You've come maybe for a while, or maybe this is your first time, and you've had this weird feeling. You don't really know how to put what it is, or you don't know how to put a finger on it, but you just know something is different. Something is eating at you. Something is kind of talking to your spirit. Let me tell you, that's the Holy Spirit calling you to himself. And you don't want to say no. Because the life God is calling you to right now is a life that you will never, ever imagine on your own. And so let me encourage you, if you feel that pricking, that conviction, like we might say in a church term, that you say yes immediately. We've been praying with people all day long of helping them say yes to God, and I haven't embarrassed anybody today, and I won't embarrass you. If you're watching with us online, you can join us in a prayer in just a moment and let us know in the chat in just a second. But if you're here on campus just because I can see you in person, I'm going to ask you to take an extra step, and that is to simply raise your hand. I'll agree with you. I'm not going to ask you to come to the front or stand up, but I want to pray with you and help you take this huge step, this eternity-shifting, life-altering step of saying yes to God. If you're here and you're like, Pastor Jeremy, would you please include me in that prayer? Would you simply lift your hand? I won't embarrass you. I just want to agree with you. I see you. I agree with you. This is an important moment. This is a moment that changes all other moments. I see you and I agree with you. Thank you. Thank you for your boldness. Anybody want to join these that say, that's me as well. The Spirit of God's calling me, and I don't know what it's all about, but I know I need to respond now. Anybody else that says, please pray for me? Or for those who raise their hand, or for those who are joining us online, or again in another maybe venue on campus, I want to lead you into this prayer. And it goes something like this. It's from our heart. Pray something along these lines. Dear God, thank you for loving me. Thank you for sending your son, Jesus, to die on the cross for me. I know that I've done wrong. I know that I'm a sinner. But thank you for forgiving me. Thank you for coming into my life and cleaning me from the inside out. Help me to walk in your ways all the days of my life. Help me to stay in your presence and live for you. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.